So it feels to me like Marvel is trying to make a movie about every possible character that they have, and DC in all of them.
I think that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I think that it's probably because we love the idea of fiction. We love the idea of there being someone with superpowers who's watching out for us and taking over. Well, I was thinking about that in relation to the Bible, and I've heard people say before, well, the Gospels are just fiction. Like it's just another Marvel movie or something like that. But, so how do we know that it's not?
Oh, easy. We know that it's not because all the Jesus movies make way less money than all the Marvel movies. Millions, maybe 1,000 bucks. No, it's a great question. So I think there's kind of 4 different parts to the answer to this. So I've jotted some notes down here, and so what is the first thing that we wrote down to lead into this?
All right, date is the first one. You need a date?
If you're asking, yeah. So the first thing is, when were the Gospels written? If the Gospels were written hundreds and hundreds of years after Jesus lived, then it would call into question whether it could be fiction or whether it could actually be historical fact. But I take the conservative view because I think it's the most reasonable. One of the reasons why I take the conservative view, which means that I believe the Gospels are written very close to the events that they talk about. One of the reasons I think this is just because of the archaeological evidence. We have a fragment that is dated to around 125 AD. Now that's not too long after Jesus's ministry. Now it's dated to that point, but we understand that that fragment came from a copy that was a copy of a copy of a copy, however many times back. It was found down in Egypt, which means it had already been circulated for a while. And so what that means is the Gospels were already being circulated widely by, 60 years after, 50 to 60, 70 years after the events. Now, there is a really debated little fragment that some people think is actually dated to about 65. That one's a little bit more debatable, but that's really early. And I think, personally, that could be legitimate. It's going to be debated for a while. But what that means is that there were copies of the Gospels very early on, within 20, 30 years of the actual events that they talk about. Now, in terms of history, that's huge. Most of the history that you accept, that you were taught in your history classes in school, come from sources that were thousands of years. Now, they weren't necessarily written thousands of years later, but the sources come from thousands of years after the events actually happened. So the Gospels are very well established in terms of manuscript evidence. So
and I guess
that's
the
first thing.
Gospels, to be clear, what we're talking about is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are all accounts of one man, Jesus,
yeah.
and his life.
And for the most part, the book of Acts could fall into this too, although I'm not saying that. But yeah, Acts, it was written by Luke alongside, kind of as the sequel. It's like a Marvel thing. The sequel to his gospel. So so that's the first thing.
And I guess that kind of leads us into the second one you've got written down, which is eyewitness accounts.
Eyewitness accounts. Now, so some people will complain that, the book of Mark, for instance, is it's not Mark's story. It's actually Peter's story. Well, yeah, that's technically true. We think that John Mark actually wrote it, but it's Peter's eyewitness account. So, and that was an accepted method in those days, that an important person who's doing a lot would have what's called an amanuensis, who's somebody who writes down his words, dictates for him, and so
be handy.
Yeah, it would be nice. So John Mark apparently wrote in Greek, and he wrote Mark, but it was from the words of Peter. So the same is true of Luke. We think that Luke's story generally came from Paul, which may have been relayed from the other apostles. Where was I going with this? The point is that they are eyewitness accounts. They claim to be eyewitness accounts. The internal evidence, like the Gospel of John, for instance, he says in the first chapter, we saw his glory. Now he's talking about Jesus there. So he's saying we, so he's including himself, but then he's also, apparently it's the other disciples, it's the other people that were there. He said, we saw his glory. Now, we hear the word glory and we think spiritual woo-woo stuff, but basically what he's saying is, we saw this dude, and he did some crazy stuff, and here's the account of it. Luke used words like eyewitness, orderly account, and things like that. So these were eyewitnesses. So they were either written by eyewitnesses or they were a recording of eyewitness accounts. So that's number 2. So the first one was when the Gospels were written, and the second one was that they are eyewitness accounts, which leads us to
number 3, which is pretty similar to number 2, during the eyewitness period.
Yeah, so the eyewitness period is could be summed up this way: how long did them eyewitnesses live? We're from East Texas, so that feels really natural. I know it sounds like a joke to you, but it's natural to me. So how long did the eyewitnesses live? So let's just imagine that that there was an 8-year-old who saw Jesus heal somebody in Judea, and then that 8-year-old lived to an old age. 80, 90, 100. It's rare, but it could happen. So what that means is that you have a period where there are still people alive who saw Jesus do stuff. And they could either falsify or corroborate the story. So the fact that these eyewitness accounts were written down while there were other eyewitnesses still alive is huge. Because what it means is if there were eyewitnesses of Jesus and they read this eyewitness account and they were like, that ain't how it happened like this, then we would expect to find those people's writings. We would expect to find sort of this opposition writing to Jesus. But you know what's interesting? We find none of that. In all of the manuscripts, thousands and thousands of manuscripts that we have from antiquity, we find none that claim that Jesus never lived. We find none that claim that Jesus never did miracles. We don't have anything like that. What we have is these accounts, these eyewitness accounts, and the silence of all of the other eyewitnesses in that period. That tells us that either some powerful force was able to destroy thousands of opposing manuscripts, or there just never were any. And that's my view, that there never were any. And so that, to me, corroborates the story because it was written. So they were written early, they were eyewitness accounts, and they were written during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses in the eyewitness period. And then the fourth...
So finally, we have Grecoroman style biography.
Yeah, so this one is kind of new within the last, actually I don't know how many years, but it's within the last number of years that some analysis has been done comparing the Gospels with Greco-Roman style biography. So what is Greco-Roman style biography? Well, let's say that you wanted to write a history about Claudius Caesar. There was a certain style that you would follow. You would leave out things that were made up, of course. You would cite your sources. There's just a process that you'd follow. And so for the Gospels, what analysis has shown is they follow that style. So this tells us a couple of things. This tells us that the original writers were educated in that style, but what's more is they wrote in that style because they wanted to tell us that, hey, we're not writing fiction here. This follows the style of nonfiction. And so, for example, Matthew, the beginning of Matthew's book, is actually written almost to a T based on a student style of organizing claims about a person. So for like the first few chapters, you can read these Greek handbooks for students on how to organize your claims of praise for an important person. Matthew follows that. And so if it were fiction, it would be different. It would be in another style. But they, by their own admission, being eyewitnesses, saying that they were eyewitnesses, and the fact that it's in that style tells us that it wasn't written to be fiction. It was written to be an accurate account. And that's exactly what Luke tells us. I set about to make an orderly account. And he goes on to talk about Jesus. And so there are lots of crazy claims in the Gospels, but the people who wrote them were convinced. I mean, that's what we gather from all of this, is that they were convinced that these things happen. So, let's recap. Number one.
We've got the date when it was written, which was real early. We've got the eyewitness accounts. It was written by people who actually saw it happening. And third, it was written during a time when other people were writing down things they were seeing happen, and none of them contradicted it. And fourth, we have it was written in the Greco-Roman style biography.
That's exactly right. So, that's how we know that the Gospels are not fiction. Now, smarter people than me could probably tell you more and more and more, but those are the basic 4 things that kind of come to my little bitty brain. So, why don't we do an exit?
Well, I'm Krista. This is Lucas for Questions from Atheists.
Thanks for watching.
I wish to do another one where I'm not doing weird hands.